All right, so let's begin. And as we briefly discussed last week, Jesus had left the wedding at Cana of Galilee. And this is in John chapter 2. And this is where he had been performing, and he performed his first miracle of changing the water to wine. And he and his disciples and his mothers and brothers had left Galilee after the wedding, and they had went to Capernaum. And that's the last verse of chapter 2. No, I'm sorry, it's verse 12, chapter 2. And after this he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. And then in verse 13, we read that the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus had went up to the temple, and he found the merchants there selling and trading in his father's house, and he had made they had made his house a trading place, and they were taking advantage of the ones that were there that had come to Jerusalem for the Passover feast that wasn't from that area, and they were taking advantage of those people. And Jesus made a whip of cords, and he ran them out. And also here in Jerusalem, we noted last week that many had seen the signs that he was doing and believed on his name. And then Nicodemus, man of the Pharisees, a ruler of the Jews, had come to Jesus at night questioning Jesus about baptism. And he was a ruler of the Jews, and when he come questioning Jesus, Jesus explained to Nicodemus how one can enter the kingdom of God by being born again of water and spirit. And then after this, Jesus and his disciples went to the Judean country, baptizing and making more disciples than John the Baptist. And although Jesus did not baptize himself, but his disciples were doing the baptizing. And then he left Judea and he went to Galilee. And on his way, he had went through Samaria in a town called Sychar. And there he met the Samaritan woman. And then he came to Cana of Galilee again at Capernaum. And he healed the official's son. And this was the second sign of Jesus that Jesus had done when he had come from Judea to Galilee. Now this has brought us back to the end of our class last week, and with Matthew's account in chapter 4. So if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 4. And this is where we read that Jesus had started his Galilean ministry. And now John the Baptist had been arrested and put into prison. And who did we say had seized John and thrown him into prison? Herod the Tetrarch, right? And Tetrarch meant governor of one of 4 governors of Galilee. Now, who was Herod the Tetrarch?
Governor.
Yep, he was governor. He was son of King Herod, and who had seized and who had sought to kill Jesus when he was a child. So this Herod was one of King Herod's sons, and one of the 4 governors of Galilee. So now, why had John the Baptist been seized and arrested? What did we discuss last week?
Or yeah.
He told him that John told him that he couldn't have his brother Philip's wife.
Right. John had told Herod that it was unlawful for him to have Herodias as his wife, and that he was doing evil things and basically sinning. And who did we say Herodias was? Anybody?
What, Philip?
Right. It's Herod's brother's, his brother Philip's wife, which means it was his sister-in-law. And we read last week in Matthew chapter 6 that Herodias had a grudge against John the Baptist, and she wanted to put him to death, but Herod had kept John safe, right? And not wanting to harm him. And the reason was because he feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man. For his people had said that John was a prophet or Elijah. And this references back to when the Jewish Pharisees had questioned him, and he had confessed that he was not a prophet. John the Baptist was confessing that he was not, and not denying that he was not a prophet, nor he was Elijah, or he was even the Messiah, right? But he was a voice of one crying in the wilderness, making the straight way of the Lord. So Herod, on his birthday, had gave a banquet for his noblemen and the military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. And what had happened at this banquet? Right. Herodias' daughter came in and danced, and that pleased Herod and it pleased his guests. So the king had told her that he would give her up to how much of his kingdom? Right, half. And so the girl, she didn't know what to do, and so she went to her mother and asked, what should I ask for? And Herodias, being a vile and vicious woman, wanting John dead, told her that you should ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And because of that oath and his guests, he ordered to have John beheaded, right? But obviously the girl had no comprehension of what she could have been given. I mean, half of the kingdom would have been substantial to her and even her mother. And we also discussed Jesus leaving Nazareth's hometown. And why did we say that Jesus had moved out of his hometown, Nazareth?
They wouldn't believe him and accept him.
Right. They wouldn't believe him. They wouldn't accept him. They rejected him. And why was he rejected?
They knew him as the carpenter's son. Joseph's son. They didn't think he was anything special.
Right. They knew who he was. They knew that he was the carpenter's son. They knew his upbringing. They were around him with as he grew up. And when he was up in the synagogue claiming that he was the Messiah and saying that he had been healing the sick and giving the blind sight, that they weren't believing. Then what did the people of Nazareth want to do with Jesus when they didn't believe? Right, they wanted to kill him. They were filled with wrath and they were filled with anger, and then they wanted to throw Jesus down the cliff of the hill that the city was built on. So the city here was in Nazareth was built on a hill, and they were going to throw him away. But what happened to Jesus?
He just walked away.
All right, he escaped in the midst of the crowd and then went away. Then in Matthew 4:14 and 15, we read that the prophet Isaiah had said that the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, was Galilee of the Gentiles. And Who did we say last week that the Gentiles were? Right, so normally, when someone is called a Gentile, they are described as someone that is not a Jew, and in the Israelites, you would use this term to describe someone who is not a descendant of Abraham through Isaac of Jacob. And Isaac's son Jacob, now who was Jacob? Right, he later became Israel. Esau's brother. He was the second born son of Isaac and Rebekah. Esau being the first. And Genesis 25 states that Jacob came out holding Esau's heel as if he was trying to hold back or pull back Esau into the womb so he could be born first. So he was wanting to be born first. He wanted to be first. And if you remember the story of Esau being famished in the fields and that he had begged Jacob to give him a bowl of soup or stew, and he wanted to he would give up his birthright to Jacob for this. And then later, Jacob is named Israel, and